Good morning, everyone. We're just getting everything set up on our end here. I'm giving it just another moment as we see the crowd begin to grow. Thank you for joining us today. Wonderful. Well, thank you again for being with us here today for this episode of Beyond the Headlines. We're so pleased to have so many folks with us today, and I know the crowd is still growing. Just want to acknowledge that I am here today on unceded Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh homelands in what's also known as Vancouver. And our office, BC's Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, works across the lands of British Columbia, so many unceded lands, as well as some treaty lands of many different nations. And our mandate stretches across those many territories. A couple of things before we jump in. ASL interpretation is available. Hopefully you can see that. Thank you to the Island Deaf and Hard of Hearing Center for coordinating American Sign Language services for us today. We've pinned all of us who are speaking as well as the ASL interpreters, but please do let us know in the chat if you have any view issues. Our team is working in the background and can help you with tech issues. If there's anything that comes up, please just let us know. We are recording as well. And closed captioning is available by clicking on the two C's. You can change the language with an arrow that's along the bottom bar of your screen, or hopefully that's what you can see. Again, any tech issues there, please just let us know. Webinar participants can't talk to each other in this format, but so if you send us messages, it comes directly to those of us on the panel here today. Questions can be submitted via the Q&A function. So that's the button again at the bottom of your screen for Q&As. That's where we will be sorting the questions and reading them in the background. We're leaving time at the end of our conversation today to answer your questions, to engage in those conversations. But please feel free to drop them in anytime as you think about them. Happy to receive your thoughts, and I look forward to that engagement. As I noted, and as you will have seen, there is a recording happening. That's so that we can post it to our website as an ongoing resource available to folks who want to engage with this content, either you, if you want to go back and look at it again, or you want to distribute it to others, and we'll be sharing this more broadly. So with those introductory comments, as hopefully is clear, I'm Kasari Govender. I'm BC's Human Rights Commissioner, and we're here for this part of this series that we've been doing to engage with thought leaders, experts, advocates, mostly from across the country. Very, very pleased today to be speaking to somebody who's a leader on the global stage, impacting human rights around the world. As you know, today's session is on freedom of speech and freedom of press, our rights to know, to discuss, to debate issues and situations, and the necessary restrictions on those rights in a free and democratic society. So we want to be talking about some of the balancing that we need to do around these rights. I'm so thrilled to be hosting today Special Rapporteur Irene Khan for this conversation. Irene, thank you so much for joining us. Irene was appointed as the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of opinion and expression in June of 2020. She is the first woman to hold this mandate. She's an internationally recognized advocate for human rights, gender equality, and social justice. She was Secretary General of Amnesty International from 2001 to 2009, and Director General of the International Development Law Organization from 2010 to 2019. Ms. Khan is affiliated with the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva and has been the consulting editor of the Daily Star, which is Bangladesh's largest English-speaking newspaper. She's worked on human rights issues from around the world, from the Philippines to Zambia, India to Macedonia, far too many countries to list, but hopefully we'll get into some of those today. Welcome, Irene. I don't know if you want to say hi here at this point.
Yes, thank you very much, Kasari, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to join you this morning.
We're so pleased that we were able to make it work. Thank you. Our inspiration today for bringing this conversation together was an inquiry that our office conducted into the use of exclusion zones by the Vancouver police in the eviction of a homeless encampment in the downtown east side a number of years ago. By way of context, especially for our international guest, the downtown east side of Vancouver has been called Canada's poorest postal code. In short, in condensed form, my findings in that inquiry were that transparency was compromised during the decampment when media were restricted from using or entering the decampment zone, that the exclusion zone was not in accordance with human rights standards, and that the oversight process followed by the Vancouver police following the incident was insufficient. So, in a nutshell, that freedom of press was not upheld. One of our goals in doing this work was to shine a light on the role that press freedom plays in protecting human rights. When police may potentially come into conflict with some of society's most marginalized folks, allegations of media being restricted from reporting on those, on that contact, on that police operation, raises some really serious red flags, and certainly raised for us the need to look more deeply and again to shine a light on these issues. The inquiry examines only 2 days in one city on one street, but I think one of the reasons we undertook it was that we wanted to ensure that restrictions on freedom of speech, like freedom of the press, anywhere in the province, comply with law going into the future, including complying with human rights protections. To that end, we continue to work on trying to implement the recommendations, and we also just released a plain language explainer of what exclusion zones are and why they matter. So I think our team has just dropped that into the chat for folks if you want to take a look at that at some point. So this bit of background brings me to my first question for you, Irene. You've said that journalism should be seen as essential humanitarian work. I want to unpack that a bit. Why do you think that? Can you give us some examples of how you've seen that at play in some of the work in some of the countries that you've worked in?
Thank you, Kasari. Freedom of expression is a human right that all of us have. It comes out of our dignity as human beings. That means it's my right to speak, but it's also my right to listen to others. And media plays an extremely important role. Media freedom is part of the right to freedom of expression, part of that human right. And media is a public watchdog. So, as a public watchdog, they are the ones who provide the information on the basis of which the public in a democracy can engage. You give an excellent example of what happened in Vancouver, where the absence of the media meant that there was no transparency. People didn't know what actually was happening, what kind of action the police or other authorities were taking, and so could not engage in it. In a humanitarian situation, it's absolutely important that those who are involved in the humanitarian situation, the people who are affected by that situation, whether it's a flood or it's a war or whether it is a decampment, need to know what's happening. They need to get correct information to be safe themselves, and others, policymakers, the general public, need to know what's happening in order to ensure that the government or the authorities or the military, as the case might be, are acting in the right way. So this watchdog role is absolutely at the heart of what is freedom of expression is all about. It's also an extremely important pillar in democratic societies. It's the way in which we get transparency and accountability.
I love that what you just said. It's freedom of expression is our right to speak, but it's also our right to listen. It's a really interesting way to talk about it, and something I think is often missed in our conversations around freedom of expression and some of the tension that we'll get into in a few minutes around freedom of expression as a very kind of insular, self-centered right, if I can say it that way. It's still very important, but that right to express being very much about it as an individual, whereas the way you're talking about it sounds more relational.
Absolutely. It's actually a social right. It's society's right to know. It's
Mm.
my right to speak and to listen, but it's also society's right to know what's happening. So that social dimension is very often missed out, as you said. It's seen as an individual right. But without freedom of expression, we couldn't survive as a society. We wouldn't have the dialogue, the exchange we need, the understanding. And that's why it's absolutely essential in times of disputes to have freedom of expression, right? So that we can resolve problems and understand what's happening around us.
Mm. In your work at the UN, you've called restrictions on press freedom in Gaza a global crisis. Why do you think it's a global crisis, and what do you see as an appropriate counter response to that?
Well, the conflict in Gaza had an impact across the world. People, whether they approved of what was happening or whether they were very upset by what was happening, they were out in the streets, as you know, in Canada, in Europe, in the Middle East, in Africa, everywhere around the world. So that's why I saw it as a global issue that affected freedom of expression. Why was it a crisis? Why do I say it's a freedom of expression crisis? Because I think the reaction of the authorities were in most cases very disappointing, where we've seen, for example, campus protests being disrupted in a violent way. We saw a lot of assemblies, protests, demonstrations being disrupted. People didn't feel they could speak properly. There was a lot of tension and violence and insecurity in that, not just in physical protest, but also in what we said, what we wrote in the papers. People felt that they were being silenced, under pressure not to speak for or against the parties on the ground, Israel or the people in Gaza. And so it became really a global test of freedom of expression. And I am sorry to say that many governments didn't pass the test. They were too harsh. They stopped unnecessarily people's protests. In a lot of cases, students, for example, got hurt because there was violence on the campus, with police coming in, removing people. We've seen that happening in the US, also in many European cities. We saw young people very angry and disappointed. And at the same time, we saw on our television screens every day, we saw on the newspaper headlines, we saw online all the devastating news coming out of Gaza about how civilians were being killed, how the war was being fought, how the atrocities were being committed. So from that point of view, I think it wasn't actually very well handled by the authorities.
What do you see as the future implications of that, if any?
Well, I think have been some deep thinkings. The first thing has been that I think governments have struggled, and democracies in particular have struggled, how to balance the security that they want, how to ensure, for example, the Jewish people are protected from anti-Semitic attacks, but at the same time permit people to exercise their right to freedom of expression to criticize what Israel is doing. That is not necessarily anti-Semitic. We criticize all governments when we feel they're not acting well. Where to draw the line? And I think they're still struggling to find the line, but I think there's a realization now that that line has to be drawn, because otherwise, what is prohibited speech and what is permitted speech gets mixed up. I think there's also an understanding that you need to protect people from hate speech, because there was a lot of anti-Semitism there. Equally, there was a lot of what is called anti-Muslim hatred. There was a lot of Muslim hatred out there too, anti-Palestinian hatred. So that hate speech has to be prohibited or restricted. And freedom of expression doesn't mean that I use my freedom of expression to attack your rights. That all of us have a right to speak, but we also have the responsibility to exercise that right in a way in which everyone can speak. Otherwise, it becomes a weapon. Freedom of expression can become a weapon for censorship. So I think there's more realization of it. But even to this day, we see protesters being arrested unnecessarily. We see a lot of misunderstanding about what is anti-Semitism and what is not anti-Semitism. And I think it's extremely important to get it right, because if you don't get it right, then the Jewish people will continue to be attacked. You're not getting to the roots of the problem. Where is the hatred coming from? And how do you protect people against that hatred? Similarly, in a multicultural society, as you have in Canada, you have all sorts of communities there. You have Palestinians, you have migrants, you have Jewish communities. Everyone has to feel safe. So that's a huge responsibility on the side of the state to make sure that people understand clearly where the lines are drawn and that people agree with those lines. Because in a democratic society, these standards are set through dialogue and understanding. So I think we've learned some things, but not enough, I would say. There's still a lot of learning to do.
You talked briefly in that answer about what's happening on university campuses, and certainly we've seen some of that play out here in Canada and British Columbia. How do you situate that in history? Like, is this a moment where you see freedom of expression on campuses being particularly restricted, or is this kind of, part of? Does it have a place in history where you can see these kinds of waves throughout history?
Well, I was recently on an official visit to Germany, where, of course, these issues have a very important impact on society, given their own history of the Holocaust. And they're still struggling to figure out ways there. And one of the things that worried me a lot was to find academics saying that they have to be careful about what they say. Students not feeling safe. I met with Jewish students who felt unsafe, but equally, I met with Palestinian students who also felt unsafe. So, yes, this is a moment in history, a very important moment, because it's not just our ability to speak. We've always had problems going back to the Greek times, to the Greek demos. But what is happening now is that social media and the use of technology has put a bigger challenge on our generation and on the younger generation for how do we use that freedom of expression as we've got it. So yes, this is a particular moment in time where we have opportunities, but we also have great risks because of our power to be able to say even the conversation that we are having. I'm sitting in Geneva, you're in Vancouver, and we can have this conversation with a lot of other people. So we have that, and that's very positive. At the same time, we need to, as I said, the information environment is polluted with a lot of hatred, with a lot of attacks on minorities and vulnerable people, like children, for example, and so on. So yes, and also on the campus, where students should feel free, academia should feel free to explore ideas without others feeling threatened by it.
Yeah.
So I think, and it's not only academia, there's also artistic freedom has also been under pressure for the same reasons. I've heard about galleries being shut down, speakers being deplatformed, and so on. So it's a very tense and difficult period for us, where we have opportunities, but also threats coming.
And what you said leads us really well onto the next area I want to talk about, which was freedom of information in the digital age. At our office, we've done a lot of work on the rise of mis and disinformation and the influence of social media on that rise, and then the influence of mis and disinformation on the rise of hate. In recent years, we've seen increases, as some of what you've already alluded to: anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, anti-trans hate, misogyny, ableism, so on and so on. At least some of that hate has been fed in a very significant way by mis and disinformation. Maybe I'll just pause there for the sake of our audience to say, we sometimes use these terms interchangeably, and we do in our office as well. Sometimes we just say misinformation for short, but what we're talking about is actually distinct concepts. Of misinformation is the sharing of incorrect information, but inadvertently. We've probably all participated in sharing misinformation at some point in our lives. Certainly online, it's very easy to do. We don't fact check generally everything we see. On the other hand, disinformation is the intentional sharing of misinformation, often for quite, problematic reasons, either corruption or to share stereotypes to undermine society. So some different concepts at play. I think our team will drop in, and it already has, it looks like, some of the links to our recent work, including a statement I made some weeks ago on recent misinformation in some of our political debates in British Columbia, as well as we've done a big public campaign. Some of you may have seen a large cell phone, a giant 9-foot cell phone that we've had traveling around the province as a way to kind of draw attention to how much power is in these little devices, and how much we need to use our critical thinking skills. And we've been sharing the STOP test with folks. Which is a way to stop misinformation, using that as an acronym to be able to kind of give us the tools to tell a fact from fiction. Irene, so let's talk more. Let's go a little deeper into freedom of expression and limits to that, and why limits are by both sides of this coin is so important to democracy. Let's start with talking about the impacts of social media on freedom of speech. We know that online spaces can be really important for activism and political organizing and marginalized voices to be heard. It's a great equalizer in some ways. And we also know that spaces can foster misinformation and hate speech and ultimately shut down marginalized voices. So we'll turn to solutions in a moment, but can we get a little deeper into some of the harms that you've seen from social media in your work, and how do you balance the benefits and the harms as you go about the world talking about these issues and reporting on these issues in your work?
Well, before I get into the harms, let me just say how important social media and our ability to communicate is. I've been around the world, as you said, from Argentina in the south to Korea in the north, across the globe, and no one has told me shut down social media, right? So and what I found is for women, for minorities, for those who are not safe, LGBTQ people who sometimes don't feel safe to come out in society, in traditional meetings, can communicate and organize and do things in ways that you could not before. So let's all agree there's huge advantage there. But at the same time, freedom of expression has been abused. It's not an unlimited right. It has limits, and for good reason. Social media has also allowed people to come in with hate, and you talked about misinformation and disinformation. And that is, of course, very harmful. We've also seen children. Monday was International Children's Day, where I, as the global Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression and regional OAS, African Union, and the OSCE Special Rapporteurs, actually put out a joint declaration about children, where children are also being attacked, abused, exploited at times online. We've talked about women and misogyny. In the case of gendered disinformation, it is particularly, I've done a full report on that and discovered through my research that there are well-organized groups, well-funded, well-organized networks, global networks that attack women, for example, women like you or ministers or others, women in the public sphere, in ways that make it almost impossible for you to work, hurtful, harmful information that can put you in danger, in physical danger. And that is basically being done to push women out of public life. So you're actually affecting diversity in that way. Same thing happens with a lot of minorities. So there is this manipulation of information. And the thing about disinformation is that it's not only lies. There's a kernel of truth in it. And that truth is then twisted. So it becomes very difficult to fight that disinformation. Because there is that little kernel of truth, and then everyone says, oh, well, there's no smoke without fire. And that makes it very difficult. And of course, the resources are unbalanced, because on one side, you may have a female candidate, for example, or you may have a migrant group. And on the other side, you have very powerfully well-funded groups that are running these campaigns, influencers with millions of listeners or audiences who are who have created, who have sort of almost manipulated information to build their own credibility, turning their anger on others. So there's a lot of problem out there. There are no easy solutions, but first of all, we need to understand the problems better. I think that's part of the problem, because many of us now no longer know what is true and what is false. We talked earlier about media and media freedom. Actually, media has a very important role to play here, because they can actually give us diverse, and we have to have diverse points of views. In a democracy, you can't say there's only a single truth. There's not just one narrative, it's just the opposite. So there is nothing that is true or false. Under international law, false information is not in itself um, um, prohibited. What is prohibited is using information to cause harm to the other, to someone else, whether it's your reputation, whether it is social stability, whether it's an election, whatever. So it is the harm that matters. And that is how information is manipulated, from elections to war, to children's welfare. We find across the board a lot of harm taking place, and usually that harm takes place because there's a big money machine behind it. The social media companies, they're making money out of it. There's billions of dollars in that. But the people who actually pay the price are the women, the children, the minorities, people living with disabilities, LGBTQI, and so on. So there's this huge imbalance that is being created in a context where freedom of expression should be an equal right for all.
Yeah, there's so much in what you said that I'd love to delve into. I just wanted to, for our audience, just speak for a moment about how money is made off of these, because I think it is an important piece of the puzzle to understand how we can get to solutions, which is that the social media companies, their business models are based on algorithms where the more traffic that's driven to certain sites, the more ad revenue from those sites. So if there's ads on the side of your feed in whatever social media app you're in, they're making money off of those. So the more that they can drive content to certain pages, the more clicks drives content. The reason that hate and misinformation so often gets more clicks is because it's designed to get our emotions aroused. So for high emotional content, people are much more likely to click. And as said by a Facebook whistleblower at one point, there's good research that Meta relies on, that negative emotions, anger, is more likely to drive clicks than positive emotions. So you can sort of begin to see the through line that where information is negative, where it's hateful, where it arouses strong feelings in response. Outrage, for example, is a really strong emotion that drives our clicks, and that drives ad revenue, which pushes up, which the entire business model is based on. Anything you wanted to add to that, Irene?
Yes, you're absolutely right. Their business model is actually it's monetizing, privatizing and monetizing our right, freedom of expression. And of course, the algorithms also try to predict what they think you are interested in, and therefore they trap you in these rabbit holes. And you think your whole world is made up of that one point of view. So it's also very divisive. You don't actually hear different points of views in a reasonable sort of way. They will continue to show you one. So that's something, and in a way, they're actually also interfering with your freedom of opinion, which is actually under international law distinct from expression. Expression is what I'm speaking. Opinion is in my mind, what I'm thinking. And through these algorithms, they actually feed us information that they think we want, and they try to predict. Even from our eyeballs, for example, they can predict what interests us or what doesn't interest us. So somehow they're trying to read our mind and then trying to re-educate us. It's a very, very dangerous thing that most people don't understand. We don't understand how we've been manipulated by the system. And behind the system, as you said, is an ad-driven business model. So the longer you stay engaged, the more money they will make, and they will therefore find out things that keep you attracted to the platform. And that, I think it's never happened before in the history of mankind. And there's one other element to think about is the size of these companies that are doing this work. Meta's annual revenue, I'm told, is equal to the GDP of 130 countries in the world. So what we are talking about is huge imbalance of power between the tech oligarchs on the one hand and governments on the other. And especially in democratic governments, how are they going to actually protect our freedom of expression, allow us to have access, but at the same time, ensure that there's a healthy information environment?
Yeah. Yeah. I think that putting it in the context of the wealth of these corporations is and how they make their income is important context. You spoke about sort of it's the harm, not the lie, that we need to get at. But I struggle with that a little bit. I certainly see the importance of it. I see the importance as a lawyer in terms of what we're trying to target. I see the importance, sort of understanding that there's not, we all have different narratives and different perspectives that are very hard to capture in a singular version of truth. On the other hand, how do we address harms without calling out the lies? The statement I mentioned earlier that we put out a few weeks ago was really focused on the trying to differentiate in a democracy how we need to have a common basis in truth on certain facts in order to have productive policy conversations, in order to decide what is the solution to this controversial or tricky social concern that's arisen. How do we deal with, the massive number of people dying of toxic drug deaths in this province, for example? And toxic drug deaths are the leading cause of death for folks from teenagehood all the way up to age 59 in this province. How do we solve that problem if we can't agree on what the basic facts are that are leading to these problems? So talk me through that a little bit about how we target the harms without targeting the lies, but still have a common basis for debate.
In many societies, they are very sure, the authorities are very sure of what is truth, what is a fact. And you know the kind of society I'm talking about, not Canada, certainly. But in authoritarian countries, of course, they know what the facts are. Now, most of the time, we are not talking about facts. There are certain issues that are facts. We are talking about points of view, viewpoints. And what freedom of expression does is it gives you the space to have a different viewpoint, even on the same facts. And in democratic societies, extremely important. People will disagree. On policy issues in particular, what you may think is a good policy, someone else will think it's not a good policy. That is why it's very important not to say that this is a fact and therefore this is truth and that is wrong. Truth. There are obviously there are scientific facts that we all need to agree on. For example, in COVID-19, during the COVID pandemic, the whole issue of vaccination and so on, there was a lot of debate about it. Even scientists didn't always agree on what science was there. So you cannot shut down the debate by saying this is a fact and that is not a fact. On some issues, what you need to do is to agree on a shared understanding of what the facts are. And that shared understanding of facts requires different points of views to be debated. That's what freedom of expression is about. And it's extremely important that everyone agrees on it and not that one person says, well, this is the fact. I'm the person who is in charge of sharing facts, and I've shared the fact, and you just have to agree with me, because that, of course, is calling for a very authoritarian type of approach to freedom of expression. The other thing is that we need to have some license, as well. Offensive speech is what is offensive to me may not be offensive to you. It may be just criticizing me. So that is why there's some latitude given in freedom of expression. If you are a politician, well, you are going to be criticized. And you're going to be criticized sometimes harshly. A woman politician as well, harshly. So we're not saying you have to be polite and civil all the time. People will lose their temper, they will shout at you. But the question is, when does that cross a certain line and become dangerous? And that is what should be forbidden. Of course, I don't have to use offensive speech. I can be polite, but I'm allowed to use offensive speech as long as I'm not actually threatening someone, you know. So a certain line has to be drawn, but at the same time, there has to be sufficient space in a democratic society for people to express their views, to express their anger, to express their dislike of issues. So, this is where the balance comes, and it's a very difficult job. There are formulas that have been used in international law. For instance, who is saying it? Where are you saying it? Are you saying it in the privacy of your home, or are you a leader, political leader, in front of 500 people? What you say there and what I say in my house, or another person, a student, says on campus, there's a difference between that. So what measure you take depends on the impact of what you're going to say or will have on people. If it's likely to lead some people to incitement to violence, then it's absolutely prohibited in international law. If it is offensive and therefore creates some social disharmony, governments may choose to restrict in some societies, and other societies they'll say, oh no, like in Sweden, for example. In Sweden, they're burning the Quran. But if they do it in Pakistan, there is a riot. So different countries will interpret restrictions in different ways, but neither in Sweden nor in Pakistan should you be saying something that would lead to the death of Muslims.
And similarly in Canada, we have offensive speech is permissible, hate speech is not. We have constitutional protections for freedom of expression, and we have human rights code protections for equality and non-discrimination. But if it crosses the line into detestation and vilification, or some of the language we use, inspiring violence, for example, or inciting violence, then we cross the line to impermissible speech. And we do have, I'm not sure if our team has dropped this into the chat yet, but there is a Q&A on our website around hate speech for those who are interested about what is illegal and under what instrument. Is it criminal offense, or is it a human rights code where somebody could complain about it? So for folks who are interested, there is that resource. The other way I'm thinking about it as you're talking is the ways in which law has a role to play here. And in my view, law does have a role, and I think and yours as well, in regulating hate speech. It doesn't in offensive speech, but that doesn't mean that culturally we shouldn't be addressing the rise of offensive speech. Excuse me. For example, you talked about the increase in kind of vitriol and anger against women leaders and the misogyny that people face. I certainly have faced a lot of it online. It doesn't mean that should be prohibited speech, but it is something we need to think about as we try to ensure that our political leaders are diverse and that women are able to occupy these spaces and others. Yeah. So is that a line that you would agree with?
Absolutely. In fact, under international law, they talk about a gradation. At one end is speech that I may not like. At the other end is very dangerous speech. So what you do is you can use a whole tool as a policymaker, as a government. You have all sorts of things, from education programs, for example, building people's awareness at times, to perhaps fining for minor offenses, down to actually criminalization. Now, from my perspective, I think criminalization should be used very, very rarely, in the most extreme case, because it is, of course, a very powerful tool, the criminal law coming in. But there's a lot that can be done through bringing communities together, to engaging in sort of dispute resolution mechanisms, or people understanding each other. Very often people don't understand each other, and that leads to a lot of conflicts here. So the tool you use should be commensurate to the damage that is likely to be caused. And of course, people who are in power, who have actually a pulpit, they have a big, big responsibility about how they use that. They can, with a word, actually calm the crowd down, or they can rouse them up. And so even who you are makes a difference to what kind of measure should be used to silence or to let the speech go ahead.
Mm-hmm. And what's your views on what tools should be used in online spaces? Do you have what are some recommendations that you may have made, or as you go around the world and learn and talk to folks about how they've addressed online hate speech? So let's start with that side, not the offensive speech, but the hate speech, the mis and disinformation online. How do you think, especially given the power imbalances that you've talked about with the tech oligarchs and the amount of the power and income that these companies have, capital that these companies have, how do states regulate them, and should they be stepping into that space?
Well, I talk about smart regulation by the state, not a not to use regulation as a blunt tool. And the state should actually minimize its own interference with the content of what I say online. But what the state should be regulating is how the companies are behaving. We talked earlier that the companies are basically running a money-making machine. So that machine, companies can ramp up or ramp down whatever hateful speech. They don't have to. For example, we have a right to speech, but we don't necessarily have a right to reach. And you know that WhatsApp, for example, stops you. You can only send a message to so many people and not more than that. So there are ways in which companies can stop the dissemination, reduce the dissemination. They can also mark things that they feel are blatantly false or can be harmful. They can actually measure it. And as you know, they do. They tell you sometimes. Or they can refer you to other things that you should also look at. During the COVID pandemic, for example, they would, on these sites where there was a lot of, on these platforms where there were a lot of misinformation going on about vaccination, the platform actually had put a label saying, you can go to the WHO study on this or that issue. Just as now you are putting out what can expand on what you're speaking, platforms can do that positively.
Mm-hmm.
Most importantly of all, platforms must actually do what we call human rights due diligence. When they create these products, then they should check their algorithms to see that the algorithms do not cause harm. That is something that the government, the state, can require platforms to do. And as you may know, that the Digital Services Act in the European Union requires large platforms to actually precisely do that. And if they're found not doing it, then of course they get fined. So they should be checking. They should be checking the flow, and they can, as you know, they can take. They also, all platforms have rules, or almost all platforms have rules, and they apply those rules. They can shut down your account, or they can send you a warning and say, don't do this again, and then shut it down, and so many different ways in which they can make people more aware of what they're saying and what harm is being caused, and therefore control that situation. The state should not get into censorship, except, as I said, in the most egregious cases. Most countries do have criminal laws. You cannot actually go online and start an insurrection. So that is the most extreme example, or ask someone to go kill other people or something like that. And those are criminal laws. And there, of course, the platform is bound to take that offline. Otherwise, the platform can be fined. But platforms can also encourage healthy speech, as I mentioned, through all these various measures.
I mean, and certainly they have that power at their fingertips. The question, I think, for so many of us is, will they? You know, we saw when, Meta, for example, end its fact checking. It laid off all the fact checkers in the US, and Mark Zuckerberg said, we see an over politicization of fact checking, and so we're ending fact checking on our platform. When Elon Musk took over on Twitter or X, he changed, a number of the restraints, including the blue checkmark system, making it a pay function as opposed to a function of actual verification. And studies have shown that significant, and he re-platformed many of the deplatformed folks that had gotten the kind of treatment, from the company. The company does have power to deplatform people. He re-platformed them, and the study showed significant increased hate as a result on that platform. What do we do in those kinds of circumstances where social media companies are putting into place these kind of regressive policies.
Well, that is precisely where the smart regulation comes in. That is the responsibility of the state to point out, like any other company that's operating out there, all companies are required not to, or required to ensure that their products do not harm people, whether it's medication, whether it's water, or whether it's social media. So similarly, some standards need to be followed, and it's up to the state then to make sure that the companies follow it. They do something else. Fact checking is one thing, but they actually now increasingly they're using AI algorithms to actually do the content moderation. So the risk is on both sides. They may take off too much. They may take down too much information. And we often find that a lot of people complain, particularly people who have a minority point of view, complain that their views are being shut down. They're being shut down and this has happened with women's groups, for example, on issues of sexual and reproductive rights in some countries, abortion issues and so on. That happens a lot. And on the other side, they miss out when there is actually a lot of hate or harmful speech out there. So that also creates discrimination in speech. So content moderation is their responsibility, and they need to follow it in the proper way. So the rules have to be set for them. And the most important thing is transparency. What do they have in their algorithms? Who knows it? You and I wouldn't be able to figure that out. And that's why it's extremely important that when we talk about transparency of platforms, what we are saying, platforms have to give access to researchers, to their algorithms, to what they're doing, to their business, so that those who know this business are checking and saying these algorithms are safe. So there has to be that kind of openness, transparency on the side of the platforms, remedies for people who are being blocked unfairly on the platform. That's also important. It's not only the harmful speech, sometimes very legitimate speech. And this is extremely important, for example, in elections, where the opposition party is removed, content of the opposition party is removed, and the content of the ruling party remains. It happens in many countries that I've come across. That kind of control is also unfair. And so the companies should do human rights due diligence. They should look at the human rights impact assessment. They should provide people with remedies when they've been wronged. They should also make it easier for people to complain. That's extremely hard. I found out, especially in the cases of women and online gender-based violence, or in the case of gender disinformation, how difficult it is for women to complain, because many platforms treat each complaint separately. So every time you get a rape threat, you can report it to the platform. But what happens in these organized campaigns against women is that you get hundreds of people slamming you with this stuff. You're not physically possible for you to respond, to complain 100 times. So there are some particular needs that certain groups have that have been attacked online. And whether it's children or women or people, as I said, who are living with disabilities, platforms have to be sensitive to that and make it possible for them to bring these complaints to the platform. And the platform has to deal with it properly, and the platform has to be held accountable. There has to be an appeal system, because sometimes they get it wrong. And I've seen that in the context of Palestinian protests and so on, where a lot of very legitimate criticism of Israel was taken off as anti-Semitic, for example. So you can also have things working the other way. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that transparency piece is such an important piece of the puzzle. It was one of the recommendations that we had in our inquiry into the rise of hate during COVID. Made recommendations directly to social media companies, and that being one of them is that transparency and oversight of how well they're doing living up to their own internal moderation policies. That's such a key piece of the puzzle.
Let me just mention one other thing, and that is what we've also seen is that because they're using algorithms are very bad at contextualizing. And as I said earlier, context is everything in speech, whether you say it in front of 500,000 people or in your bedroom. And of course, algorithms don't understand cultural context. So something that you're saying in Canada is fine. If you say it in Zambia, it could be quite dangerous. And they don't understand that. And the data that they have is very much Silicon Valley oriented data. So algorithms are running on a Silicon Valley type of culture, whereas the world have many different cultures. So we actually find that in developing countries or among minorities and so on, a much higher rate of, I would call, abuse of information, abuse of access, higher violence, because those algorithms don't understand the context.
That's such an interesting point. Yeah,
Mm.
really useful. Um, with one of the solutions that's being talked about and in Australia being implemented is the social media ban for young people. Canadian government is having a very similar conversation right now. Seems to have moved away from an online harm bill, similar to the EU version that you pointed us to. They seem to be moving more towards the Australia model and banning social media for youth. What's your perspective on that?
Well, it's interesting you raised that. On Monday was International Children's Day, and we actually issued a joint declaration I mentioned earlier. And there we said that children have a right to freedom of expression, and according to their maturity, and what the guiding principle here for children should be the best interests of the child. Now, a social media ban is not, we are not in favor of it, because we believe that it should be geared to the age of children. It should allow a lot of children, when I say children, it's anyone under the age of 18. So you have your 15, 16, 17-year-olds who have organized climate justice movements online. You ban them from social media, you will probably lose half of the climate justice. You know, a third of the users online, 1 in 3, is actually below the age of 18 today. So there's a huge number of young people who are using it. In Australia, yes, they introduced the ban, and I don't know how many million accounts were taken down by Facebook. And within a month, almost the same amount of accounts came online again. So children, teenagers will find their way to get back online. So social media, you cannot take them off social media in that way. And besides, they need to have access to information, they need to socialize, they need to meet people. There are all sorts of uses that children have for it. What you need to do is to make sure that they're not harmed by the information. And that means a much more selective approach. It means proper content moderation by these platforms. You know, they have the technology, they can do a better job on it. So I would suggest that the government should focus on what the companies are doing and how the companies can control the information properly and make sure that harmful information doesn't get to children. One of the issues with children is also addiction. You know, many children get addicted. Children have been harmed. They have committed suicide, in fact, been so socially upset by the various algorithms, the way the algorithms have worked in their case. Those kinds of things the companies can remove. So the companies can create safer space without a total social media ban being brought in. In fact, from Australia, there is a piece of news coming that young people, teenagers now, are much less informed on the news because they tend to get their news on social media. They don't sit and watch TV or read newspapers. And so that's actually affecting their knowledge, their level of knowledge about what's happening in their societies or in the world, if you ban them from social media. Besides, age assurance is a very difficult issue. A lot of children, or a lot of people cannot provide the ID or information. It can interfere with adults' access, and children, and you can create new inequalities. You know, immigrant children who don't have proper papers, for example, would not get access because they cannot prove their age. So this anything that is total, anything that is indiscriminate in the area of freedom of expression tends to be quite dangerous, you know, because the context is different. And therefore, I would suggest a much more targeted, carefully designed. The most important thing is to get companies to actually put the best interest of the child in program design.
Right.
Right from the beginning, right from the source, not try to deal with it later downstream.
Right. That kind of upstream approach.
Mm.
Yeah, I think we're just thinking through some of those implications, and you've given me and I'm sure our audience a lot to think about in terms of what the implications would be for young people. Certainly recognizing that young people will find a way to get online anyway. But also, your point around climate justice activism is a great one. We're silencing young leaders in that process as well. Um, along those lines, we have, so I will, for our audience, just say we're opening up for audience questions now. So please do, some people have already started to drop their questions into the Q&A. Please add yours. I'll start with one that came in a little while ago. There's somebody who says, when I was a student, there was a lot of fear on campus that made students scared to engage in protests in support of Gaza. What is the responsibility of post-secondary institutions to ensure that students and staff have freedom of expression without experiencing consequences for their activism?
Well, I think the answer is simple. I think people should be allowed to protest about Gaza, to protest about genocide, to protest about atrocities that are taking place there. That's a right. I think what people are not allowed to do is to make it dangerous for Jewish people, Jewish students who are on campus. So you should not be directing your incendiary statements towards individuals there. But at the same time, criticizing what is happening either in Gaza or any other war, the Sudan as well, and look at what's happening there, should be allowed on campus. And as I said, campuses should be a safe space to discuss and debate about what's happening in Gaza. If you disagree and you believe that no, war crimes are not being committed, then have a discussion about it and let the other side also come and put the evidence out there and get to understand each other better. And I think the academic arena allows that much better than, say, the public square in town. So if you protest in town, you won't have that opportunity to debate. But in a campus where you're living in a student community with scholars, with different ideas and theories and understanding of what happens during war and what is legal or lawful or unlawful, you can have great classes, I think. I'm a professor, so I can say that one can make these live situations a teaching moment, rather than a censorship moment.
Right. Another question here is, polarizing rhetoric by political leaders has been used as a tool to create divisions, perpetuate hate against minority groups, and gain votes. How should political leaders be held accountable for their divisive political rhetoric?
Well, I think there are many different ways in which they can be held responsible. The first, I would say, is the political party itself. I think political parties should have a code of conduct for their candidates to avoid this kind of divisive, dangerous speech and expel candidates if they don't follow those rules. That's the internal one. Then, of course, there is, of course, the state machinery. The courts are there, and other ways that we talked about before to stop this kind of thing. But first and foremost, I think the political parties have to get responsible, and politicians themselves should realize that they will be held to account. There will be consequences for this kind of divisive approach.
Thank you for that. It's a significant issue in our province at the moment, as I know it is many places, but it's been very present for many of us here. Turning a little bit to journalism, back to journalism, can you speak to what, if anything, has changed in journalistic integrity through mainstream media, and what needs to be done to protect our right to access accurate information? Seems to me, sorry, I'll just finish the thought and then pass it over to you. This person says, it seems to me that most journalists now repeat PR notes and selectively interview experts who have a financial stake in the matter being discussed. This seems to be what pushes many into seeking news on social media.
Well, I think what's actually happening is, first of all, media itself is in a very serious dire situation, I would say, and a big part of it is financial, because they're losing revenue to social media, and so therefore, A, they don't have the quality, and B, they try to do the same tactics of drawing attention and sensational news, etc., and not reporting properly.
Yeah.
So both sides, I think there is an impact on the quality of journalism. And this is a very serious problem. The other problem, of course, is media ownership. We don't talk about it much. We talk about digital oligarchs, but before the digital oligarchs came on board, we have had the media moguls. And so you have less diversity. And when all the news is all the news seems to be the same, then you're not interested in the news anymore. So yes, the quality of journalism is extremely important, and there are some efforts going in there. But the biggest problem is media is a commercial business and is being beaten down by social media. So there again, there's another responsibility of the state, of policymakers, to look at that issue and see how do we ensure this diversity. Media freedom is about editorial independence, but it's also about diversity of media, diversity of viewpoints, editorial pluralism. Media pluralism is very, very important. I think there's a big role there for policymakers to look into it, and for the media sector itself to wake up and cooperate and not just sell whatever sells, but ensure that there is truth in journalism.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, being never having been a journalist, but being on the other side of the microphone, having been interviewed, being in the media for, let's say, the last 15 years or so, I've seen a real shift, even over the time that I have been here and working in this area, of how many resources media outlets have, and then the depth of the story that follows. It used to be that you really wouldn't do, in our context at least, there wouldn't be a news story about something where you were, something but that your organization had done, unless you were interviewed for that. Now the resources are just, people have to produce stories so quickly. They're often going out without anything further. Maybe they're taking a quote from a press conference and then running with it. And that feels, to be on the other side of the camera, often it feels like a resource issue, that they just aren't enough journalists there to be able to cover all the news stories. I guess coupled with the fact that we have this 24-hour,
Yeah.
all year long, there are no off days anymore in terms of the news. It's just a constant cycle. There's so much content to fill.
Well, there's a bigger threat than misinformation and disinformation that's climbing on us, and we haven't really addressed it. And that is this information slop, as they call it. AI slop. There is so much of information being thrown at us every day. Some of it true, some of it untrue, some of it poor quality, some of it half true. All that. So, and as human beings, we can only take so much. And I think something has to be done in the whole area of education, media, information, and digital literacy. And I'm talking literacy, not skills. We all have digital skills. We need digital literacy. And that is a long-term thing. I'm talking about something that should start in schools and go right up into with adults. But unless we do that, we're living in the digital age, and we are dealing with still with the old methods of dealing with information. That's a big disconnect there.
Absolutely. And it was a big piece of why we have been running this campaign on mis and disinformation, and the kind of concept behind the giant cell phone that I described of, we are so connected to this tiny little device that for so many of us, we look at, the moment we wake up, and last thing we look at before we go to bed. And that we're just bombarded with the amount of that information, that it's a much outsized presence in our lives. And this tiny little device might otherwise, if aliens came from space, they might not have the sense of how much of our brain space is consumed by what we get through our devices. And excuse me, one of the recommendations that we continue to push forward, but that emerged actually from that hate inquiry that I talked about in response to COVID, was to improve our digital literacy through the K-12 education system, our public education system, and it really hasn't been picked up by our provincial government, unfortunately. But our digital literacy framework, we do have one for educating young people, but its content on mis and disinformation is extremely low and outdated. And so we're not giving teachers the resources they need to teach young people. And it is this massive gap in terms of how much time and energy young people are spending online, who are often better actually at discerning mis and disinformation than older folks, but they're also getting so much more content. Just so constantly, and we'll have a lifetime of that, as opposed to those of us who've, it's arisen during our lifetime. Do you have any perspective on why that seems hard to move forward, these recommendations about improving our digital literacy, especially among young people?
Well, I think it's because the people who are the policymakers don't understand, don't have digital literacy themselves. It's a different generation. There's a generational transition that's taking place as well. And it also depends, I guess, on what kind of situation you are in. I know that in the Baltic states, they have a very high level of digital literacy. And in Finland, for example, I think 8-year-olds are taught the difference between a false elephant and a real elephant on social media. And that is because they're building social resilience against the disinformation that they fear coming out of Russia.
Yeah.
So they are actually, this is about social resilience. And I think if we see it as social resilience than just as social media, we will probably look at this whole issue in a very different way.
That's an interesting suggestion. Yeah, absolutely. Just looking through some of these other questions that are coming in here. I'm trying not to miss them as they come in. There's a question about, so I don't know if you followed this dynamic in Canada, but there was a piece of legislation that was passed a few years ago, that impacted social media companies about paying for news. As a result, they banned access to mainstream news sources online. How do you think this might be feeding the polarization and harming protections for those who are marginalized in that context?
First of all, it just shows how much power the social media company have. Here's the government's trying to legislate, and social media pulls out the news. Now, I have a report going to the Human Rights Council in a couple of weeks' time, to the UN Human Rights Council. And one of the examples that I've used is this Canadian example that you just mentioned about Meta. I think had stopped allowing access to news on its platforms. But I used examples. I can't remember right now, but I found examples of media outlets, small media outlets, local, state level media outlets that have actually turned that around to create open Facebook accounts in which they talk about how news is made. They're not allowed to say what the news is, because Meta won't allow it, but they're talking about how they make the news, and they've actually attracted more readers. And now they are a bigger outlet. I think they've grown about 5 or 6 times in the last year or so by using that. So it also shows how creative people can be. So my report is full of creative examples of how through these in small ways, through our creativity, we are fighting back against those big mega digital oligarchs.
Right. Interesting. A great example. One person says, I'm part of a few community organizations, and the topic of press freedom and freedom of expression can feel so big and hard to address from my vantage point. What would you suggest I can do as a neighbor and community leader to help address access to information and truth?
Well, I think one of the things we have to understand is, as we were talking about, there's a huge flood of information. So therefore, making it interesting for people to engage, that you can do if you want people to access information, providing diverse points of views to people, and also diverse forms of media. I think we have become so obsessed with social media that we forget that it's still nice to read something in print. It's still nice to sit in front of a television, for example. And most of all, it's nice to talk to people, in small groups. And I think there should be more of that at the community level, because I keep talking about this social right. I mean, freedom of expression is a social right. We need social resilience. We need more of resilient, communities, groups, etc. So I think at that level is where really the difference will come. Community newspapers are disappearing. Community contact is disappearing. Children, one of the negative impacts of social media on children is that they no longer go out and play. They don't make friends through play. They make friends through the telephone. So I think getting a balance there, and that's a responsibility for all of us, because it's something very personal. The government can't come in as a nanny state and tell us what to do. But each of us, as a member of the community, I think each of us can make a difference.
Yeah. Yes, those are all really good suggestions. I would also add, and this relates as well to an earlier question about holding leaders accountable for some of the polarized content, which is, taking into account what you've said, Irene, about making sure that we don't kind of get too expansive about what we see as facts, as incontrovertible facts. But we do need, I think, to be able to try to separate out in our polarized debates, our in our policy conversations, what facts we might be able to agree on, and then what policy conversations, what policy questions are that are still that are up for debate. And I use policy questions, that maybe sounds more like it's more aimed at political leaders, but I think we're all having those conversations in one way or another. And as you say, that sort of private conversations that we have, that trying to separate those out a little bit, perhaps take some of the emotion out of the facts. And so if we wrap them all together, the high emotional content that we've been trained to kind of feed off of in our current digital environment, that we bring into our everyday lives, I think that fuels so much of the hyperpolarization in our societies, that perhaps we can unplug some of that energy when we try to differentiate what are the facts. So, for example, we've been having a debate here in BC, which I'm sure is replicated in some form in many places in the world, which is how much content there should be in school curriculum around sexual orientation and gender identity, and what are age appropriate conversations, what should be in schools, and how much control should parents have over that. Well, in BC, that conversation has often, and across Canada, actually, that conversation has often been rooted in some pretty fundamental mistruths, lies, things that are just simply not true. So we have, for example, there's a lot of fear that the curriculum, then it's not even curriculum, but it's materials for teachers that we have in BC schools are explicit, that the materials on sexual orientation and gender identity, they're called SOGI materials, are full of sex ed. They are specifically grooming children for sexual assault. That teachers are pedophiles. These are the basic assumptions that people have. So then when they're talking about how much of this should be in schools, very understandably, they are terrified for their children. And weighing into this conversation, some of the backlash I've gotten, I've been called a pedophile far too many times to count. And I remember one person saying on social media to me, "You couldn't possibly be a parent, or you couldn't hold this position." Well, I am a parent. I'm a parent of a school-aged child, and I thought, but you're right. If I believed the facts that you believe, I wouldn't be able to hold the position I have now. If I thought that my school was being designed around grooming my child for sexual abuse, I would be protesting with you. But so, trying to, as individuals in our own conversations, trying to separate out some of the facts that we might be able to just kind of agree exist. That curriculum is online. Those materials are online. They're actually anti-bullying inclusion materials. Yes, they talk about gender identity and sexual orientation, but they're actually designed to help teachers talk to kids about exclusion, inclusion, anti-bullying. So go read those materials. Then let's have a conversation about whether they belong in schools or not.
Yeah, you've made a very interesting point there, and that is about getting the facts out there. The empirical evidence is very interesting, very important. And what I have found is that, at the end of the day, fighting disinformation is about building public trust, because people don't trust something that you're saying as a fact. If they trust you, they will trust what you say, and therefore it becomes a fact to them. So building that trust, and you build that trust by being consistent in the information you're providing to them. So from their own life experience, they see, okay, it matches. And therefore, what Kasari is saying is true, and I will believe Kasari or not. So that public trust is key. And when we talked earlier about politicians who spread false information or divisive information, or community leaders who don't, who are misleading people, being divisive, that the damage that happens is of public trust. I don't trust you. And if I don't trust you, it doesn't matter what you tell me, how many times you tell me this is the fact, I won't believe you. And so that is extremely important for anyone in with any form of authority, whether it's a school teacher or whether it's a community leader, a politician, a state institution, that you make sure you don't lose your public trust, and you don't lose your public trust as long as you're consistent, you're clear, you are well motivated, and you're transparent in what you're doing. People will trust you, and that becomes very valuable when you have to share that empirical evidence with them.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. The trust of the speaker is essential to being able to establish those facts. Another question here. What are your thoughts on the compassion fatigue many folks are dealing with as they are bombarded with so much information, true and false alike? There are many that have strong beliefs and the desire for the equity of minorities and protections from hate and misinformation, but remain passive as there are so many issues affecting vulnerable groups. What can be done to make people act on their compassion and promote equality and regulation towards the hateful outcomes perpetuated by media?
Well, that's a very big question in a way, but I go back to again this building contacts and working at the community level. That's very important for compassion, because if you hear about 2 million people being affected in Gaza, it's very hard for you to understand 2 million people. What can you do? You totally get overwhelmed. But if someone says, "Look, there's a refugee in our community now who's just arrived from that part of the world, and we need to do something to help that person," you know that's a different proposition, right? So I think bringing things down to the human side, building public trust. I mean, we have to, the technology is out there, and the technology will continue to develop and provide these wonderful tools and some very dangerous tools for us. But there are some things that are very essential to us as human beings. And I think that is what we need to hold on in this very difficult world. How you build compassion, I don't think there's a simple answer to that. It's on a case by case basis, in communities, in everything we do as people.
Yeah, yeah. Perhaps related, but moving more towards responsibilities of leaders. So this person says, as a public service employee, it is often tricky to talk about genocide in Gaza, or for that matter, any human rights issue in any way to raise awareness. What should the proper role of leadership be in creating safe space so they are not penalized?
Well, Canada as a country has been at the forefront of human rights around the world, championing human rights around the world. And Canada has participated in peacekeeping operations. Canada has done a lot of good work in popularizing human rights and getting people to understand. So I hope that when human rights are violated, Canadian citizens would be free to discuss it among themselves and with others. And if people don't feel free, then I'm sorry, that's a very sad state of affairs. Civil servants, of course, should not take sides, but civil servants do have opinions. They do understand what is right and what is wrong, and should be able to express that in appropriate ways and not stay silent when there is something like a global, genocide is a global issue. Yes, it might happen in Gaza. It's happened in Rwanda. It's happened in my own country, in Bangladesh at one point, in different parts of the world. But I think we all, Geno, the Gen in it, the human part of it, means we need to speak out against it so it doesn't happen again. That's what we're trying to do. So I think if we look at it in a solution-oriented way, we are, as you say, get the facts right, and we're not abusive about it. We're not unfair in the way in which we criticize what is happening. I think we should be able to do that. I don't know what your exact rules are in Canada about codes of conduct for civil servants, but civil servants do have political views, but they should express them in a way in which they're not seen as being partisan.
Mm-hmm. You said this leads me to sort of think about the responsibility of leaders in a variety of ways. And you noted earlier the importance of context. Of course, you said this a couple times, and the significant contextual difference of saying something offensive or hateful in a small, in your living room, versus, or you're around your dinner table versus, a person speaking to 500,000 followers, and the different responsibility that flows from that. The law in British Columbia has been evolving recently on this, kind of in the other direction, actually. That there was at least a strong argument that protections for leaders should be in place so that they can have more leeway because they're the ones making some policy decisions. But there has been some recent case law kind of restricting some of that and saying, but they still have responsibilities not to be hateful in those environments. There's a question here. We're headed into municipal elections across BC in October. So local governments, do you have any hopes of what you want to see in the media landscape and our collective discourses as we head into this period? Which may be a bit more of a question for me, but I think you may be able to speak to how you have seen these issues play out in the context of local government elections, and then I can speak specifically to BC.
Well, I think, as we were saying earlier, it's about media playing its proper role. That media takes their role very seriously, puts across information in a balanced sort of way, make sure that all sides are out. All sides of an argument are out there, and doesn't appear partisan on one side or the other. Doesn't mislead people, and calls out when wrongs are done. Election times are what I call, there are, as an information crisis point. There are certain situations which are information crisis points, and elections are a very important information crisis point. And in those crisis points, media have a role to play, very responsible role to play, and they have to play it responsibly, and call out when things are not going well, making things transparent, allowing healthy democratic debate to take place. And I think municipal elections are a good example, because they're really at the level at which people care, because it affects our daily lives, schools and roads and street lights or whatever, much more than distant policies that are, whether it's foreign policy or something that's happening in Ottawa,
Yeah,
right? So
yeah.
they do matter to people, and media have a very important role to play. The important thing is, do you have local media? And is your local media well financed and in a balanced sort of way, so that they have the people on the ground? Because sometimes, you get more information about national elections than you do at local level, because local media has disappeared from so many communities. It may not be the same for you in Canada, but in many parts of the world, there are media deserts now.
Yes, we do have significant issues in terms of local media. We do have local papers still across and local radio stations across the province, but the papers are owned centrally, so they're media conglomerates, published as small newspapers. And then we have the CBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, who is publicly owned, and is a common source, I think, and has radio access across the province. So other places that don't have their own radio stations do still have access to CBC. And I would say I agree that those play a significant role in the elections, in any elections, but particularly local ones. And I would say that my hopes specific here to this upcoming October and what that means for our province are, reflecting back on the last municipal elections. We had concerted efforts from some sort of political factions to run candidates across the province in multiple places to push forward certain political agendas. So, for example, an anti-trans agenda across the province to get people elected to school boards. Those efforts were largely ineffective, but I think it's an important reminder in our conversation today, and the events in the province in the last couple of months are important reminders to ensure that, again, we're holding our candidates, regardless of political stripe for us or for them, that we're holding our candidates to a high standard in terms of getting their facts right. And that we're not kind of letting people get away with, again, building inflammatory policy statements off of facts that or information that isn't true. For example, and that applies both to sort of scientific facts, but also what does the current law say? So law can change, and that's an appropriate conversation debate for folks to have. But we need to be able to articulate what a legal decision or what a piece of legislation actually says. That's something that most citizens are not, well, they're not, there's that. That's something we should be able to look to our leaders to be able to articulate. Let's hold them to a high standard to get that right. And then we can have conversations about what might need to change or not. So we're having a broad conversation, obviously, around Indigenous rights in the province. There's a huge amount of fear right now around private property and the impact of Indigenous land rights on private property, but a huge amount of misinformation about the potential impact. And many political leaders of from all sides of the spectrum, from all levels of government, are relying on information that just isn't true. And it is absolutely affecting our elections. And I think that's broadly known. Most Canadians do feel like misinformation negatively affects or does impact elections. So I think that's the number one hope that I would have as we go into local government elections, that we hold our leaders to account for the information that they spread, and that we don't spread it ourselves inadvertently as well, that we don't remember that these misinformation stories are designed to spark our outrage. We've all done this. This is not some problem over there. I know I have spread stories where I felt this is outrageous, this is terrible, and I've pressed share, or I've told somebody over the kitchen table. Let's hold ourselves to a high account, because in this era of information overload, we are all susceptible, and we all have to gain those tools and commitment to not spreading misinformation, so that we can have balanced elections and important political conversations that need to happen. Irene, we have so valued your contributions, you joining us here today. I've taken some notes. I wish I had the time to take even more. I pulled out some nuggets in what you were saying, that there's a kernel of truth. There's a kernel of truth in lies, and that makes the lies difficult to fight. That there's a right to speech, but not a right to reach. That what was the one I just wrote down? Elections are an information crisis point. Your point around the role of young people as climate justice activists, and the importance of ensuring that they have freedom of speech and ability to connect with each other online, that our information environment is polluted, was an important one. And I wanted to return to the point that we highlighted at the beginning. You said, and I highlighted, which is there's both my right to speak and my right to listen to others, and that freedom of speech is a collective right for the good of our society, as well as an individually held right, which I think is something so important for us to hold on to as we emerge from this conversation. So very grateful for all that you brought us with here today. Thank you to everyone joining us for all those many insightful, important conversation sparks and questions. I hope that you got what you were looking for out of this conversation. You have a long list of resources that our team has dropped into the chat. Please know that this conversation is recorded, this is part of a longer series. We've got a number of ones already recorded with other leaders. Please take a look if you're interested, and we will have further chapters to go out as well. And I believe you will get a survey to fill out to give us some feedback. So please do. We definitely take into account your feedback. So please let us know what worked for you and what didn't. And we hope you join us again. Irene, thank you so much again. It was such a pleasure meeting with you and talking with you today.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity.
Take care, everyone.